Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of MythConception Busters, where we look at the misconceptions about Judaism. Joining us again this week from Jews for Judaism is Rabbi Michael Skobac. Good afternoon. Good morning for you, actually. Good morning.
Good morning and good
I
afternoon.
know.
And somewhere it's good evening.
That's right. That's very confusing. So this is actually the third program. And this week we're going to have a look at the topic, which is Save Me. Judaism is all about salvation through works. And I suppose this is a perspective that I often get questioned about. If you don't offer sacrifices, how are you forgiven? And obviously the Christian perspective is they have a one-time offering, a one-time sacrifice, which offers them salvation straight away through belief. And that therefore Judaism must only offer salvation through physical commandments or mitzvah. What's your perspective on that?
It's clearly a view that people have had of Judaism, I guess going back to the critique of the Pharisees primarily in the Christian Bible. And there is almost a caricature that's painted of Jews, Pharisees, rabbinic Jews, through the pages of the New Testament, where Judaism is seen in a very caricatured way. The Pharisees are almost seen as these anal retentive people that are only concerned about, doing this and not doing that, and just following rules. And so there's a false dichotomy that's presented between what's referred to as a works-based religion and a faith-based religion, meaning that Christianity is held up as a religion of faith, true spirituality, and Judaism, is just lost in this fog of religion. It's lost in this fog of just mechanical practices and just doing things physically, but not really spiritually.
I guess part of the issue there is the use of the word salvation. It's kind of it denotes some sort of reward, doesn't it? That you get enough stamps and you get a free coffee at the end. But when I read the Torah and the stories in the Torah, and I see these people getting salvation, it doesn't seem to me to be a spiritual reward at the end of their journey. It's more about them surviving the day or being rescued from some political or physical issue.
Yeah, I think that part of the problem is that Christianity begins with the premise that we need to be saved from something. I mean, that's one of the questions that I'm often asked: are you saved? Have you been saved? And so there's an assumption that there's some need to be saved, meaning that somehow your default position is that you're in deep trouble, that somehow we come into this world needing to be saved. And so the entire approach, the entire thrust of the theology is directed towards that one problem: how do you get saved? Judaism doesn't begin with that premise that somehow we start off, in great spiritual danger and needing to be saved. So there's sort of apples and oranges, apples and pears, or apples and something kind of problem here, that we're not really dealing with the same kind of issues. And I think what's interesting is that the caricature that people have had of Judaism is unfortunately based upon reading material that's very, very one-sided. It's interesting that if you open up a dictionary, almost most dictionaries that I've seen, if you look up the word Pharisee, so the definition is a religious hypocrite. That's what a Pharisee is, religious hypocrite. Now, that unfortunate caricature is based upon, just simply reading the New Testament, meaning that how would a person have that kind of a perspective? It would be if all they knew about the Pharisees is by reading the Christian scriptures. But it's interesting that when you've had, over the course of the past several centuries, Christian scholars who decided to try to understand the Pharisees from their own perspective, meaning let's not just read, what our Bible says about them, but let's hear them in their own words. What are they all about? What is their world? Who are they as spiritual people? These are Christian scholars that walked away with a very different kind of perspective. They didn't emerge when people studied the writings of the Pharisees and the lives of the Pharisees, they didn't emerge, as these pathetic, hypocritical people who were only interested in, following rules. What I wanted to try and focus on is this idea of Judaism as just being about following the rules, just about works. Is it all about just what you do and keeping the law? And, is it simply a matter of works? And is Judaism limited and focused entirely upon just following rules and works? And is there anything more to the Jewish point of view? And I think, again, this misconception, we can very easily determine where it comes from, because that's the way Judaism is lampooned on the pages of the Christian Bible. That, they are seen as people without any kind of spiritual direction. They're just interested in following rules, and they don't really have any kind of relationship with God. And so Christians tend to see themselves as people that, we have a relationship with God, and Jews are just interested in playing religion.
I've heard that, and I've been asked before, when talking about maybe the prayers in the Siddur, that they're by rote. So the accusation is, how can they be meaningful if everyone's reading the same prayers all the time? Isn't it just kind of you're just crossing it off the chart for the day, off the sheet for the day? And I guess Judaism does have that tarnish painted to it, where you do have a list of achievements to try and get through. But so from your perspective, obviously you don't wake up in the morning and say, I have a number of things I have to do today or I'm in trouble. I mean, these are blessings that you undertake, aren't they, rather than work engagements or chores?
It's interesting that I heard a story once from Roger Kamenetz, who wrote a wonderful book called The Jew and the Lotus. And he was basically a secular Jew that went to India to chronicle meetings between the Dalai Lama and Jewish teachers and rabbis. And, in discussion with the Dalai Lama, he was asked, why he doesn't really practice Judaism. And so he said that for him, Judaism is just a bunch of do's and don'ts. And the Dalai Lama turned to him and said, well, Roger, why don't you see these practices, rather than as simply a list of do's and don'ts, as opportunities for spiritual growth? And, it's unfortunate that it took the Dalai Lama, the head of the Tibetan Buddhists, to explain to Roger Kamenetz what the mitzvot really are. It's interesting that it's very often that I hear from Christians that I speak with, this sort of critique of Judaism is just interested in the law and in following rules. And one thing that's important to remember is that we shouldn't diminish the importance of following rules, meaning that if we're interested in having a relationship with God, I think God has a say in the relationship. And it's pretty clear that when we read the Bible, God takes his instructions to us seriously. I mean, that we would assume that if God did not intend for us to live according to certain rules and instructions, and that's really what the word Torah means. Torah means instructions. He wouldn't have put them in the Bible. And I think that there's often an assumption that a life of the Spirit and a life of love is beyond the law. You don't really need to have rules when you have love. But the truth is that we know that the two really go together. For example, parents that love their children give their children directions. If the parents didn't really love their children, they really wouldn't be interested so much in shaping their lives and advising the children how to live. So because God loves us, he commands us. The commandments are really an expression of his love. So for us as God's children and people that seek to have a relationship with God, we shouldn't diminish the importance of observing the Torah, observing the commandments. It's certainly part of having a relationship.
I guess the other perspective is true. If a child knows that even though he doesn't want to, maybe cleaning his bedroom is going to please his parents, then he might want to do that because he loves his parents. Then it's not about the chore. It's not about the rule then at all. It's about a willingness to comply. So yeah, I guess that's a two-way street.
Yeah, I mean, it's really part of the relationship of love is that when you really love someone, you seek to do their will. You seek to do what they ask you to do. And what we understand about God is that his instructions are not capricious. I mean, he's not simply bossing us around because he likes to control people. We assume that there are extremely profound and meaningful reasons why he gives us these commandments. And part of what Jews have done for the past 3,000 years is plumb and explore and try to really see the incredible wisdom and beauty and depth of each of God's commandments. But on the simplest level, obedience is not, based upon our understanding fully why God commanded something. It's simply enough for us to have the attitude and the posture of obedience, meaning that as a child of God, as a servant of God, I want to obey. I want to do what God tells me. And again, we assume that God has extremely deep and profound reasons for giving us these commandments, and we assume that they are for our benefit, not for his benefit.
So that sounds much more like faith. When someone says a mitzvah, it can almost sound like a clinical separation. So faith hasn't really got anything to do with it. The love hasn't got anything to do with it. And I've often read on pages that are discussing Judaism from maybe a not a very favorable viewpoint, that a mitzvah is just something that you have to do. But if you don't understand perhaps why you have to do it, but you go ahead and you do it anyway, that sounds like a much more faithful and spiritual activity, just doing it because you've been told you have to.
Well, it's interesting that the word mitzvah is usually is translated as a commandment, and it doesn't sound very sexy. It doesn't sound very spiritual. But it's interesting that when you look at the way this word mitzvah was translated by Christians and by Jews, it's very revealing. So, for example, in the Greek Testament, Paul translates the word mitzvah. The word Torah. The word Torah. So it's translated in the Greek as nomos, N-O-M-O-S, and nomos means law. The Torah is seen as law. And when Jews translated the Bible into their vernacular, it was translated into Aramaic, and there the word is rendered into oraisa, which means light. So I often ask people to do this simple meditation if they just close their eyes and think about how these two words sound and how they feel, law and light. So the word law is pretty sterile, and it's cold, and it's static, and it doesn't sound very spiritual, but the word light is very dynamic, it's very spiritual, it's very vibrant, and it has a very different valence to it, a very different feeling to it. And so when you look at the Torah as law, it's a book of law, it's a book of rules, it's regulations. It's almost as spiritual sounding as thou shalt not park, with this place, or, this doesn't seem to be much there that deals with our relationship with God, whereas the word light, light is life-giving. Light is, one of the most spiritual images we have. A light, a flame, is something that by its very nature moves upward. It seeks to go upward. And so the way we frame these very words, I made a mistake before. I was about to talk about the word mitzvah. The word mitzvah in its Aramaic or Hebraic roots, the etymological root is the word sevet or tzavta, which means connection or connector. So more than being a commandment, a mitzvah is really a connector. Mitzvah is something that connects us and binds us. And it's interesting, one of the things that we do in Hebrew is we have a number of different ways of manipulating the Hebrew alphabet. And we have a thing called atbash. Atbash is where you take the first letter of the alphabet and you switch it with the last letter, and the second letter becomes the second to the last letter. So when you take the word mitzvah, it's mem, tzadi, vav, hey. So mem in this atbash thing becomes yud. Mem, the letter mem becomes the letter yud. The letter tzadi becomes the letter hey, because tzadi is the fifth letter from the end of the alphabet, so it becomes the fifth letter from the beginning. So the word mitzvah, if you do this atbash thing, spells out yud hey vav hey. It's the name of God. And so what the mitzvah is there to do is to connect us to God. That's the whole purpose, really, of the Torah. When Jews understand what the Torah is, it's there not simply as a book of rules of do's and don'ts, but it's a comprehensive and holistic way of living in which every single thing we do connects us to God. And that's what it's really all about. Really, it seems like, it looks like, it can look like a life of just works, and you're just working and working and working, and you're not really getting anywhere. But the one who understands what it's all about understands that every single lifting of the finger and every movement of the body is a movement toward God, because that's really the ultimate purpose of each of these commandments, is to connect us to God. It's all about faith. So the Christian makes the artificial distinction between works and faith, but the Jew understands that the focus and the goal of all of the works and all of the commandments and all of the practices that God instructs us to do is really to get us to Him. It's to bind us to Him. And what's interesting is the Torah itself frames the commandments, meaning that it's very possible. I think it's certainly a legitimate critique of one of the dangers of a Torah-centered life, is that it can become mechanical. It can become mindless. And so the Torah itself doesn't only give us commandments of do this and don't do that, don't work on the Sabbath and don't eat shellfish, but the Torah constantly speaks about the sort of meta themes, these big ticket items, like the importance of loving God and fearing God, and the concept, especially in the book of Deuteronomy, of attaching ourselves to God, called devekut. So amazing that the Bible begins with this story of creation, and God says that therefore every man shall leave his mother and father and attach himself to his wife. V'davak ba'ishto. It's a very, very strong word. I mean, it's the word that speaks about the most intimate connection between a man and a woman. In modern Hebrew, the word devek is glue. And the Bible very daringly takes that same word and uses it to speak about our relationship with God. It speaks about this idea of to attach ourselves to God. So the book of Deuteronomy specifically keeps on framing this life of obedience to God and the performance of the Torah, the doing of the Torah, really as all part of this overarching aspiration to attach ourselves to God. So it's only possible to walk away with this stereotype and this caricature if you really take the commandments out of context, because the Bible itself is always contextualizing the doing of the Torah in this bigger picture of love of God, of fear of God, of being in awe of God, of attaching ourselves to God. We put in, let's say, the book of Psalms, we see this life of prayer and constantly being in prayer and constantly speaking to God. And the commandment in Leviticus of becoming holy, which means trying to model our lives after God and be more like God. The Bible basically tries to not just give us the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. And so when we combine both of these things, it's impossible to walk away with this stereotype, with this caricature of Judaism being a cold, silly, frozen obsession with just performance of little details. It's really living a life of holiness. It's living a life of obedience. It's living a life of attachment to God. It's living a life of love of God. That's what it's really all about. And it's only by unfairly isolating the performance of the commandments from everything else that you could have this stereotype.
It sounds like we have on the one side a picture of an employer with employees, and they're doing what they need to do to get through the day. And on the other hand, a family unit where you have the siblings trying to live within the rules of the house for the father of the house. I know which way I'd want to lean on that. I love the concept of being glued to God. I think that's lovely.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that when the rabbis get to this topic, because the Torah, I tried to say, the Torah tries to frame all these things for us and contextualize it, but the rabbis were very, very sensitive to this problem. There's a very amazing passage in the Talmud where they say that, Jerusalem was destroyed because the Jews followed the Torah. And, the Talmud itself sort of catches itself and says, what? Jerusalem was destroyed because they followed the Torah? We thought that would be a good thing. And the rabbis say, yes, they followed the Torah, they observed the Torah, but they didn't go beyond the letter of the law. Meaning that there's this idea that you can make the observance of the Torah itself an idolatry. You can make the following of rules an end in of itself. And so what the rabbis are saying is that when people have an attitude that, I have a checklist Judaism, I just do this and I don't do that, and I'm just focused on doing things mechanically, they say that's really, really disastrous place to be. It would be like, for example, a person gets married, and on their wedding day, they say to their spouse, to the beloved, I love you very much, and I care about you, and I'm willing to actually do every single thing that our marriage contracts requires me to do, but don't think of ever asking me to do anything that's not actually written in our marriage contract. I mean, that's a horrible relationship. Or if a person came to work the first day and said to the boss, look, I'm willing to get here at 9 o'clock in the morning and I'm willing to do everything on my job description, but don't even think about asking me to stay 1 minute after 5 or to do anything that's not on my job description. That's a recipe for disaster. So when a Jew, God forbid, would have that kind of attitude, which says, look, I'm willing to follow the rules, but I'm not interested in anything other than following the rules, that's a life where the rabbis say leads to destruction. That we have to see ourselves not simply as robots that follow rules. It's not just following the law. It's even going beyond the letter of the law and realizing the law points to something. The Torah is there for us to develop a relationship. And so the rabbis speak about this idea of the Torah being black fire on white fire. The black fire are the discrete letters of the Torah that you can see. And they're the actual do's and don'ts. They're the discrete regulations of the Torah. But then on a parchment, there's the white fire, the background of everything, which is not the letter of the law, it's the spirit of the law. And the rabbis say that this is even holier than the letter of the law, that somehow this idea of what the Torah is all about, the spirit of the Torah, what its goals are, what its aspirations are, where it's pointing us to, that's really what it's all about. And the rabbis themselves understood that it's very possible to live a life that's spiritually empty, even though a person is observing the Torah. There's a passage in the Talmud where they say that even the emptiest Jews are as full of commandments as a pomegranate. And they say the tradition that a pomegranate has 613 seeds. But it's a strange thing to say that the emptiest Jew is as full of commandments as a pomegranate, because that's a lot of commandments. So why would you call such a person empty? Meaning that it would seem like that person is full. And yet the Talmud says the emptiest Jew is as full of commandments as a pomegranate. So I once heard it explained that they were very precise in using this analogy to a pomegranate, because they say that, for example, if you eat an apple, when you bite into an apple, it's all apple. Everything that your mouth, that your lips, that your tongue, that your teeth encounters is apple. It's all apple, or a banana, or a pear. But when you eat a pomegranate, you're getting these discrete seeds. You get this seed, you get that seed. There's nothing that binds them all together. And so what the Talmud is saying here is that when a person lives a life where the Torah is just a bunch of do's and don'ts, this, don't do that, it's just basically a checklist kind of Judaism. They're saying it's very empty. It's a very empty kind of experience. And the thing that's supposed to glue them all together, the thing that's supposed to, the overarching, uniting principle behind all these different seeds is supposed to be this idea that everything is there to point us, to connect us to God. So that when the commandments are done as a way of attaching ourselves to God, then it's a very, very spiritually fulfilling kind of practice. But when we just remove the commandments from that context, it just becomes a way of mechanically doing things, as the prophet Isaiah says, right? Isaiah accused Jewish people of performing commandments by rote. They were just learned activities, learned behaviors, almost like you train a dog to jump through a hoop. The commandments are not jumping through a hoop. The commandments, the Torah, the mitzvot are there really to help us build ourselves spiritually, to build a connection to God, to really help us attach ourselves to God, to live a life of faith where everything I do during the day is to help keep my consciousness attached to God.
Would it be fair to say that they're a framework on which we are to grow a relationship? You know, like if you were growing tomatoes in your garden, you'd stick a framework down and tomatoes would grow up, and then eventually those would bear different fruit than frame-shaped fruit.
That's a great image, yeah. That's a very good image.
I'm going to go slightly off tangent. For our listeners who are not Jewish, but who want to seek a better relationship with their Creator, and perhaps they want to take on some of the mitzvot that they read about when they open up their Bibles. Do you have any advice that you can direct them on? There are a lot of people who they want to engage, but maybe they feel they can't because they're not Jewish, or they want to do certain things, and because it's kind of odd, you know. I mean, charity is a mitzvah for anybody, isn't it?
Yes.
Right. So those kind of things. That's what I'm talking about.
Well, I think it's important to understand the perspective of Judaism. Judaism never really taught that a person has to become a Jew in order to have a relationship with God. It's one of the reasons why, for example, when Ruth wanted to come back to Israel with Naomi and leave her homeland and leave her people, Naomi didn't encourage her. Naomi said, stay where you are, stay with your own people. You don't need to become part of the Jewish people in order to have a spiritual life. And it's one of the reasons why Judaism never really thought it was important to encourage people to convert, because a person can have a personal relationship with God without being a Jew. One of the things I recommend people do, and I'm contacted now daily, every single day, by numerous people who are not Jewish that are seeking some way of connecting with God. And the first thing I really ask them to do is to get their hands on a wonderful little book written by a friend of mine, Professor James Tabor. The book is called Restoring Abrahamic Faith. And he basically says that way before there was Judaism, there were people who had deeply spiritual lives, people like Noah and Abraham, and their life was not revolving around, keeping kosher or observing, the specifically Jewish practices of the Torah, but it was basically a life of fellowship with God and a life of righteousness and a life of kindness and a life of spiritual sensitivity. And I think that would be the place that I would start. I would say that the foundation of a spiritual life is to live a life in fellowship with God, which means to keep God at the forefront of your consciousness, to constantly be speaking to God, constantly praying to God. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov would encourage people, just speak to God like you would speak to a good friend. And during the day, take time every day to ask God for what you need in life, and ask God to provide not just for your personal needs, but for the needs of others, for the needs of the world, and to thank God for the things that you have, and to keep that constant communication open by constantly praying and speaking with God, and to try to, again, live a life of righteousness, a life of kindness, a life of charity, a life where we model ourselves after the attributes of God. That, I'd say, would be the foundation. And I think that if a person would want a wonderful resource for this kind of starting point, Professor Tabor's book, Restoring Abrahamic Faith, is a great place to start. And then Judaism teaches that, a non-Jew who is drawn toward observing the Torah is certainly permitted to do so if they would like. If their soul draws them to want to observe the dietary laws, then there's no problem with them doing that. But I would say that, a foundation would be to think about this model of what was a spiritual life like in the days before the Torah, in the days before, the specific Jewish obligations were given at Mount Sinai. There was a universal spiritual path that people followed. And that would be really, for me, what I would recommend as a starting point. And then if there's a desire to go further, then by all means.
I appreciate that, and I second the critique of the book. I've read that book myself. It's awesome. There'll be a link of where you can buy that book underneath the program. And I think we also did a chat. Me and Jono had a chat with Professor Tabor about that book as well, and there should be a link to that as well. Well, I want to thank you, Rabbi Skobac. That was awesome. I really enjoyed that, and I'm sure our listeners will too.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here with you.
Thank you, listeners, for joining us again this week. If you have any questions, please post them below. And don't forget to go and visit Rabbi Skobac on his YouTube channel and on his website. Links for those will be on the screen at the moment and underneath this video. And we shall see you all again soon. Bye-bye.